Alpha.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this live stream from Visual Impact in Teddington. If you're just joining us, if you haven't already seen the little plug and commercial that's running. Just a little bit about Visual Impact. Visual Impact are a professional equipment dealer based here in Teddington. My relationship actually goes back decades with Visual Impact, and they've been providing me with the equipment that I use. This FX6 is one that I have purchased from Visual Impact, and they have a full service facility, big rental department, everything that you need and all that support. And I really would encourage anybody watching this video to create a relationship with your dealer. These are expensive pieces of equipment that you're buying, and you could go online and you could shop around for the very, very rock bottom cheapest price and maybe save £20 here, £30 there. But by buying from a dealer, you have that backup and support after sales service that you won't get if you make your purchase online in the same way. And I'm a big believer in building a relationship with the dealer, getting to know them, they get to know you, and then when things don't work out quite the way they should perhaps, as sometimes happens, then your chances of getting that resolved quickly are much increased. And I really can't recommend Visual Impact enough. Anyway, so moving on, I'm just excuse me while I just bring up some PowerPoint slides. I promise this will not be a death by PowerPoint session. I do have some slides. Oh, we don't want to see that, do we? Here we go, that's better. And these are the things that we're going to be covering today. So we've got an overview of the camera. I think most of you probably know what the camera is all about anyway, to be honest. How to use zebras, histogram, waveform to assess your exposure, because it'll be important to understand those things before we move on to some of the other things. Differences between shooting in the different modes, SDR, HDR, and Cine EI. And we'll look at what then in a bit more depth is S-Cinetone. How should you use it and when should you use it? Then changing the way the images look in the SDR mode. And I know we've already had some questions about that have come in, and so we'll address that as we go along. Then we'll look at the Cine EI mode with S-Log3, and we'll finish up with frame rates and S&Q motion. But do bear in mind that I've only actually got about an hour thereabouts to go through all of this, so it will be quite quick. Do keep the questions coming in. I will keep an eye on those comments as they come in and answer anything as we go along. And we'll have a look at that. So in fact, a question that's come in now, let's have a look at that one straight away. So how do I like the new Sony full frame primes? They were released with the FX3. Do you like them? I'm assuming we're talking about the 24mm and the new really small pancake lenses actually that Sony have just released. And they're actually really nice. I don't own any yet, but I have played with the 24mm, and they produce a really good image. They're not expensive, woohoo, which is a good thing. And they have Sony's latest linear focus system. So all of the lenses that Sony produce for this camera, they're essentially fly-by-wire. So the focus is done electronically. The early generations of lenses were very much stills lenses designed for photography and to work with autofocus. So there was not perhaps the greatest method of turning the focus ring and the camera focusing. The new linear focus that they've got in the new lenses, the 24mm and the new pancake lenses, is so much nicer to use manually. It still isn't repeatable like a true manual lens, and you're not going to get that with a lower cost stills type lens, because for the autofocus to work, the autofocus can't have a lot of drag. So you can't have a mechanical physical connection between the focus controls and the AF for the AF to work quickly enough to work well. So fly-by-wire is kind of an essential thing, unfortunately. But the new motors, the way that focus ring behaves and operates is much more like using a manual focus lens when you use it manually. And that is very, very welcome. And for that reason alone, I really like them. And optically, they're very good, and the price is right. So yeah, I mean, let's move along. So first thing to cover is exposure. And how do you measure your exposure? Because there's no point in me talking about all the other stuff that I'm going to talk about today unless we know how to measure our exposure. So this is my FX6 here. I've just returned actually just yesterday from Iceland, filming the volcano out there. And in fact, I noticed my lens is still covered in volcanic ash this morning, which is probably not a good thing because it's really sharp, so I need to get that cleaned. How do we measure exposure? So my favorite tool on the FX6 is the waveform. That's the thing in the bottom right of the screen that you can see now. And as I go up and down in exposure, it goes up and down. So when I'm underexposed, it's all squashed down at the bottom of the image. And when I'm up here, nice and bright, approaching overexposure, it's not overexposed, it's just exposed probably about right actually. It goes around 3/4 of the way up that display. Now there are two useful things on this, in particular on the FX6, these two orange lines that you can see. And the two orange lines represent the zebra levels. So if I go now into the camera's main menu, and let me just come back from here, and I go to the zebra settings down here. At the moment, they're set to the factory defaults of 70% at Zebra 1 and 100% at Zebra 2. Now, the way these zebras behave is a little bit different between 1 and 2. So Zebra 1, as you can see below, has a window, an aperture of 10%. So Zebra 1, as the camera is currently set, is going to come on from 65% to 75%. Now, this would be your typical exposure for normal white skin tones. And then Zebra 2 just has that single setting, which is 100%. Now, Zebra 2 will come on from the setting, the level it's set to, and everything above that. So if I was to set Zebra 2, let's say, let's take it way, way down. I wouldn't normally set it anywhere like this. Let's set it to 40%. And we turn it on. Now, you're not going to see this, actually. I've just realized that, of course, on the screen because of the way the zebras work. But what Zebra 2 would do is come on from 40% and upwards. So anything brighter than 40% would have zebras on it. So that's not really useful at a very low level. So normally Zebra 2, what you're using it for is an indication of overexposure. So you might have it set to 100%, and then anything brighter than 100% would have zebras on it. So that will show that those parts of the image are approaching clipping. But where these zebras are really useful is the fact that they also draw these orange lines on the waveform. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to set Zebra 2 here to 70, no, actually we're in Cinetone, aren't we, to 83%. And then I'm actually going to change Zebra 1 to 60%. Now, if I turn that off, you'll see that the two orange lines on the histogram, on the waveform, are now much closer together because the lower one is 60% and the upper one is 83%. Now, why did I pick those two levels? Well, we're in the standard shooting mode and we're using S-Cinetone. You can see it says S-Cinetone up there. Now, S-Cinetone is a little bit different to standard gamma curves. S-Cinetone is designed to give you a more sort of film-like look. And because it's designed to give you a more film-like look, the shape of the curve is different. It isn't Rec. 709. If it was Rec. 709, it would look like Rec. 709. It would look pretty much like any other Sony camera, and it wouldn't look film-like. So we have this different curve, and to make it look film-like, you want to expose it a little bit differently. And if you ever watch a movie and have a look at the levels in feature films and movies, you'll find skin tones are generally much lower than they are in regular run-of-the-mill television. So S-Cinetone really likes to have skin tones a little bit darker. My personal preference is to have skin tones around 60%, but it's going to be somewhere between 60 and 70. It won't be 70 and above. So if you set zebras to 70, don't forget you've got that window of plus and minus 5%, so they're going to come on at 65 and go off at 75. Zebras at 75% on a white face is pretty hot for S-Cinetone. It won't look great. So if you want zebras at all, you're going to be using just a hint of zebras if they're set at 70. But I prefer then to use them at 60, and then I'll have zebras over pretty much all of a face. Now, I don't have a great deal of light in here, so I'm actually going to use a slightly odd shutter speed. So I'm actually going to turn my shutter speed down to 1/24th. I'm at 24p because that'll just give me a bit more light. And what we can now see looking at this chart, and this, you've got to remember this is a test chart that we're looking at, is that our white parts, because this is a picture, they should be at 83%. That's the optimum level for S-cinetone. And if I move the exposure just down a tiny bit so that my peaks are on that 83% line there, if you look at the skin tones now, the faces of the girls, which makes up the bulk of this image, you'll see that that now falls along that 60% line because the faces are at 60%. So this relationship actually between white and skin tones and then middle grey is fixed. So when the white, and remember this is a picture that we're looking at, it's not a real wave in the real sea, so it's only basically a white piece of card. If we expose that at 83%, then my skin tones will end up around 60%, centered on 60%, and we'll get a great, good exposure. You can see actually that if you look along the orange, the lower orange line, which is the 60% line, that the white girl who occupies sort of a third of the image in straddles that 60% line quite nicely. She probably goes up to about close to 70% almost. The little dotted line above it is 75%. But then the darker skinned girls are lower than that. And this is of course one of the problems with using zebras, is that not every face is the same brightness. So you can't just expose every single face at 60% or 70% your preferred value and it be right, because a darker face should look darker and a brighter face should look brighter. And that's part of your skill as a camera operator, to make those sort of decisions and choices when you're shooting, to look at those things. So a question that's come in actually about the dynamic range of S-cinetone. So dynamic range of S-cinetone is about 10.5 stops. And this is one of the trade-offs. So wherever you have, most of us are viewing our images on standard dynamic range, Rec. 709 TVs and monitors, and most of our audiences that we're still delivering the bulk of stuff in standard dynamic range. Those display devices can only show 6 or 7 stops. Now, if you try and cram 14 stops or the S-Log3 into those TVs, as we all know, it looks very flat, it looks washed out, it doesn't look right. So we can't realistically have that bigger dynamic range because the picture won't look great. So we want to reduce the dynamic range because we want some contrast in the pictures. We want the mid-range to look normal. We don't want it to look flat and unusual. So the only way you can do that is by reducing the dynamic range that you pass on. When you shoot with log, which we'll come on to in more depth in a minute, one of the things to consider is when you grade that log and you add your LUT, you are actually throwing away a huge amount of your captured dynamic range. Most of your image will actually be within a very, very small dynamic range, and then your highlights are compressed like crazy generally to squeeze them in at the top so they still look like highlights. So really, whenever you go to Rec. 709, you can never really truly make use of the full dynamic range that these cameras can capture without then sacrificing a lot of contrast in your final picture. So there's lots of trade-offs that go on here. Someone's asked, can I talk about settings for, let's bring this up so you can see. How do we make an F5 match S-cinetone? The answer is you don't. You can't. That curve does not exist in that camera. It's a very complex curve, so it's very difficult to create a LUT to completely mimic it and match it. And there's just so many reasons why you can't do it. The sensor is different, so the whole color science of the camera is different. So you can't make FS5, F5, FS7, etc. match these cameras, FX3, FX6, FX9 in S-cinetone. You simply can't do it. And that's really why these cameras are as nice as they are, is that color science that they have, the new sensors, all that underlying technology that makes it look better, that cannot be reproduced on the previous generations of cameras. It's just, it's not physically possible. Yeah, another one that's come up here, actually slightly off topic and off track, is have I used the Sony cell phone for HDMI monitoring and live streaming yet with the FX6? And the answer is yes, I have. So that's the Sony Xperia Pro, which I took to Iceland with me. And I used it as a monitor because in Iceland, to get to the volcano, and there's going to be a whole series of videos and stories about this trip, or the 2 trips that I've made now out to Iceland. Currently, to get to the volcano, it's about a 5-kilometer hike, and it's 5 kilometers along, and it's 1 kilometer and a bit up. So, and depending on which route you take, it's really a difficult climb, especially when you're carrying camera kit. So to keep the kit really, really light, but to still have a larger monitor, I use the Sony Xperia Pro, which has an HDMI input. And then you can just connect the camera to the phone. And because the HDMI input is separate to the USB-C power socket, you can power it and HDMI into the phone. It's an HDR screen. It's a really good monitor. I love the fact that you can pinch to zoom in. That's a great feature. And then you can stream the feed from the camera in 4K live where you have a good enough connection. Now, around the volcano, there is a cell connection, but it's really limited. It's in a very remote area, and there is a temporary cell that's been put in to give you cell phone coverage, but it doesn't have 5G. The 4G has a lot of limitations in it, so I wasn't really able to use it for streaming. I have, but not from the volcano. But it's certainly an interesting piece of kit to look at. Is it worth buying? It's ever so expensive. But it does give you a monitor, gives you a really good streaming device. So if you're somebody that does live news and a lot of live work and things like that, I think it is absolutely worth having. For those of us that maybe only occasionally might use it, you'd have to weigh it up for yourself as to whether it's something that you want to get. Now, so just quickly looking at questions. So let's just have a look at this one, an interesting question. So I use glasses for close work, so I have trouble with the new viewfinder screens with no eyepieces. Have I used the FX9 for run and gun with an eyepiece? So I'm assuming that means the FX6. And does it work without an elaborate rig? Right, okay, so as you can see, I'm a glasses wearer too, so I completely sympathize with anybody. And as we all get older, you do lose your near vision. So using a small screen like this becomes harder and harder. In fact, even a young person, when they're stood this close to a screen, it's not going to be fully in focus. So you are missing some of the details on that screen, and there's no point in just going closer and closer because it just gets less and less focused. So you have some options. So the one, perhaps my favorite actually, and the simplest, is to buy one of these. And this is the FX9 viewfinder loop. It's available as a spare part. You can make the FS7 one work as well, if you can find an FS7 one. And that fits directly on here, like so. And now I have a magnifier. I don't need to have any extra power cables to run an external viewfinder, etc. The only issue with this, let me just clip it on properly, is that, as you probably can see already, the hinge on the camera that supports this isn't actually very strong, and it does tend to droop. There are ways around it. You can wrap a rubber band around here, and that will stiffen it up, and that works. It's not exactly professional, but it works. Or you can add brackets to reinforce it. And there's different systems coming out from different people. This is the one from Vocus. And this, got to remember how to fit it now. Take the viewfinder off here. This slides over the viewfinder. It slides over there, and then this supports the viewfinder. It doesn't add a lot of weight or anything else, and that gets around that problem. This is a really nice piece of kit. It has like a fluid damping system in here, so once it's on, it supports the viewfinder, but you can still adjust it, and then you can put the loop on top. Your other option is to use a third-party viewfinder, maybe a Zacuto Gratical or one of the Zacuto ones. But there are issues with that. You've got to power them separately, so you then need DTAPs on your battery. You might be using your DTAP to power a larger monitor. You tie up an SDI or an HDMI, feeding those. And there's reasons why perhaps I prefer not to use those and prefer to go this route with one of these. And the other thing with a lot of the shorter viewfinders, there's a very good reason this is as long as it is, and that is to prevent the sun from destroying your LCD screen. The shorter you make this, the more magnification you have to use, and the more magnification you have to use, the more the sun will burn your screen if you leave this pointing up at the sun. And it's really easy to end up destroying your LCD. It takes only seconds. You could just be walking along with your camera, and this happens to be pointing along at the sun as you're walking along because you've forgotten to tilt it down. And you get to your location to start shooting, and you've got blue squiggles and zigzags all over your screen, and your screen that's it, basically. It's going to need replacing. So the shorter ones, if you use them, such as the Zacutos and many, many others, be really careful about the sun because they will burn almost instantly. This, I've never actually seen anyone burn their screen with one of these on. It's why it's as long as it is, and there's also part of the optics includes an infrared filter to filter out some of the damaging light that causes your problems. Right, so moving on. Okay, so the camera has, as we kind of touched on already, different modes. So if I go into the quick menu on the camera, and let me go to here, we've got the shooting mode. And if I click on there, we've got custom and we've got Cine EI. Now, custom mode gives you basically what you see is what you get shooting. And in custom mode, if I go into the full menu, let me go back to here, and we go to the paint settings, we have a number of different presets that we can recall. There's only the four: S-Cinetone, Standard, Still, and ITU 709. Now, one of the questions that came in much earlier today from very early in the day, let me just find it, was this one, is looking at the picture profiles with Cine Gamma 2. Are they available? If not, what's the workaround? So no, they're not available. And there's no really sort of simple workaround for it. However, the way the profiles work in this camera is quite different to most other cameras because these are actually lookup tables. So they're actually LUTs. So if I go back from here, what you can do is you can import here a LUT into the camera. So let's have a look. I've got one here. So this one's called Chess. This is a LUT that I created, and this particular LUT sort of mimics the look of destination. Oh, I've already loaded that. Hang on. Yes. So if I select that, it's a LUT that I've loaded into the camera. If I now select it, so this is now my new look, and you can see it's very different to what I had before. You can see it's a washed out, that sort of almost movie sort of teal and orange type look, but a very subtle one. So this mimics the Netflix drama Chess. But you can load as base looks into the camera LUTs, and then you can select any of those LUTs. They're stored in the LUT memories. So this is a different one here. This is a Kodak look. You can see now this is much more teal and orange. Very, very different. And let's have a look at another one. And Blockbuster. So this is on the Sony website, this one. And again, this is another teal and orange movie look. So you can load LUTs into the camera, and then in custom mode, you can load those LUTs into your base settings, and you can then create a load of different looks. So for Cinetone, I haven't done LUTs for Cinetone, but on my website on xdcam-user.com, you will find that there are a set of hypergamma LUTs. So hypergamma and cineatone are pretty much exactly the same thing. In fact, a couple of them are identical. And you can download those hypergamma LUTs, put them on an SD card, and it has to go in the lower slot, slot 2, and then you can import those LUTs. So if we go to import, if I had a card with LUTs in, you'd go to an empty slot. Sorry, so you can see what I'm doing. So I don't have a card in the camera currently with LUTs on, but you go to base look here, you go to import, you choose where to save it. So you'd put it into one of these empty slots in the camera. So let's say here, and it says no file because I don't have an SD card in the camera with some of those LUTs on. But if you had an SD card with a 3D cube LUT on it, it would appear on this page. You'd select it, load it into the camera, and then once it's in the camera, you can then select it, and you can use that as your base look. So any LUT, in fact. And it does give you great flexibility in creating instant looks straight out of the camera in custom mode. And I think it's one of the really powerful tools of the camera that has that flexibility to, yes, Queen's Gambit, I just commented on, it's not chess, to give you that flexibility. Actually, that LUT, the chess one, I'm really pleased with the way this one's come out. Oops, I want to select it. And you're right, it's the Queen's Gambit is what it was based on. And really pleased with the look that you get from this particular LUT. It's a very contemporary look without being too teal and orange. And this is not just for monitoring, this is what you record. In custom mode, what you see in the viewfinder is what is recorded. So this is the image that the camera will record. Is there a way to change the 0 EV setting of the LUTs? I'm not sure. So if the LUT's been designed correctly, it should work at 0 EV. You shouldn't need to put in a plus or minus offset. As an example, so this LUT here, because we're going more for the film look and because this is mimicking the look of the Queen's Gambit, which was actually quite dark overall, the levels are meant to be lower. If I was to expose this brighter, it starts to become a bit flatter. You could expose it a bit darker, but that's not the way it's designed to be used. If I go now and load a different LUT, if we go back, if we go back to S-Cinetone, I haven't changed my exposure, same exposure. They're exposed correctly. They're both exposed correctly, but they do give two different looks. You could, if you need to change the auto exposure offset, you can go into your shooting settings, into auto exposure, and you can adjust your EV level here up and down, plus or minus, to offset your exposure if you're using auto exposure. So you can add in an offset there. So this is custom mode. You also have the ability in the main menu under shooting, under project, in custom mode to shoot in HDR, HLG, by changing this to HLG. And now the camera is outputting for an HDR display, and the image now looks a bit washed out. This is one of the two HDR gammas in the camera. There's HDR Live. Now HDR Live, which is what's selected currently, is designed for exactly what I'm doing now, in fact, which is direct to air. So you'd use HDR Live when you want to create something that doesn't look wrong in Rec. 709, but will also work on an HDR TV. So this will be HDR on an HDR TV, but it looks like this, Rec. 709-ish, on a Rec. 709 display. So it gives you that sort of compatibility between the two. You can also change that in the paint settings to got to remember how to do that. Yeah, we can reset HDR natural. And HDR natural is designed to be, sorry, let me show you where that was, had the wrong feed up. So it's in the paint setting, under scene file, preset recall. You only get this option when you're in the HDR mode. You can choose HDR natural, which is a more closer match to the HLG standard, but it does start to look a little bit flat and washed out, and the colors look a bit odd when you use this one direct in Rec. 709. This really is designed purely for HDR production, when all you're doing is HDR output. To be honest, I don't do a lot of stuff with HLG because I find it much better to shoot using S-Log3 and grade for HDR rather than do it this way around. So that is shooting in custom mode, either with standard SDR and using different base looks to create different looks, or perhaps now HDR and HLG for HLG. Now HLG for HDR is a very limited curve. A lot of it is very similar to Rec. 709, and then all the HDR bits just in the top highlight part. If you really want to do something really good in HDR, you want to shoot with S-Log3. And if you want to do any grading for SDR, your best way to do that is by shooting with S-Log3. And the best way to do that in this camera is with the Cine EI mode. So let's put the camera into the Cine EI mode. I could do this with the touch screen as well, but I'm going to do it this way. So changing my shooting mode to Cine EI and just execute that. Okay, so I'm now in the Cine EI mode. And if we look at the output here, you'll see that I'm using the S709 LUT. You'll see it says S-Log3, S-Gamut3 Cine. S709 LUT is my monitoring LUT. And just above the waveform, it says S-Log3, sorry, LUT S709. And that is what the waveform is measuring. So now with shooting with log, it's really important to get the exposure just right. So actually one of the questions actually that's come up, let's just bring this up. Is there a way to record both the LUT baked in and in log mode simultaneously? And do you know if there is a way, any developments on autofocus tracking on the FX6? So autofocus tracking, I don't know. I don't know what is being developed in the firmware for the camera. In terms of baking in the LUT and recording S-Log3 with the camera on its own, no, there's no way to do it. If you want to do that, you have to have the FX9. So the FX9 can shoot XAVCI, S-Log3 in 4K and record MPEG-2 HD, which is broadcast quality, in HD with the LUT baked in at the same time. So the FX9 has that ability. This camera doesn't. Basically, the media isn't fast enough to record two streams at once. The SD cards are not, they're getting better, but they're not the fastest of media. You could do it with an external recorder by recording the S-Log3 on either the camera or the recorder, and then with the LUT, just think about it, you could record on the recorder. So you'd record the S-Log3 in camera, turn the LUT on your SDI or HDMI out, and then record that on the external recorder. But it would require an extra hardware to do it. So coming back to shooting with Cine EI. So with the S709 LUT, again, it's important to get your exposure right. Now, it's one of the questions that came up earlier again was about shooting and overexposing with this camera. There isn't any need to do that. That was something that was necessary with the FS5, F5, 55, FS7, etc., because the sensor in those cameras was inherently quite a bit noisier, and the appearance of the noise wasn't very nice in those cameras. So to get your desirable image nicely above the noise, I found, and I personally recommended people shoot a bit brighter than the basic Sony recommendation. So that involved using a low EI generally. With this camera, and the same with the FX9, you don't need to do that. You really don't. The noise level on this camera is at least a stop lower than it was on those other cameras, so there is no need to expose 2 stops brighter. There just isn't. When I shoot with this camera, I shoot at 800 EI, which matches the 800 ISO exposure rating of the camera, and I get great results. If you're doing that and you're getting a poor result, it probably means you don't have enough light in your scene, or your average light levels are too low. And it's really important to understand that when you shoot a dark scene, it's actually the highlights that matter and how you expose the brighter parts. So when you shoot a nighttime scene or something like that, what's really key is contrast. It's not about having a picture that's dark, it's about having a contrasty picture. Because how do you tell how bright or dark something is within an image? Well, you do that by looking at the highlights and the shadows, and then your brain figures out what's in between. So if you've got a really bright highlight in your night scene, your blacks and shadows can be really dark and black, and they will look dark and black. But if you don't have that highlight, if you don't have anything bright in your night scene, there's nothing to look at, there's nothing to watch. So it then becomes tempting to try and bring the gain up, to bring the shadows and everything else up, and then the picture falls apart with noise. So shooting at night, shooting in the dark, it's really important that whatever you shoot has contrast. If you try and shoot something that doesn't have any contrast, and I think this is where a lot of people make a big mistake with shooting in the dark, it's never going to work. You could go out and shoot a street that's lit by street lights. If there's nothing catching the light, if you're just looking at the pavement and everything else, it will be dark. And if you try and bring the level of the pavement up to make it look nice, it'll get noisy. But as soon as you add something like a street sign or a person who's lit within that otherwise dark shot, all the other stuff can stay really dark, and then it stays noise-free, and the whole shot will look great. So really the key with this camera is just about exposing it correctly. It doesn't need to be overexposed, it doesn't need anything like that, it just needs to be exposed right. So the right levels for the S709 LUT are different to S-Cinetone. There's nothing helpful going on from Sony, unfortunately, here in that particular case. So if I go back into my menus again, and let's go back to my monitoring menu on the camera. So I'm in the monitoring menu. I'm going to go back to my zebras now. And instead of Zebra 2 being at 83%, I'm going to bring this down to 77%. And I'm actually going to leave Zebra 1 at 60%. Because again, I'm going to have a similar for my skin tones. So now on my waveform, again, I have 2 lines. One is at 77% currently, and one is at 60%. And if you look, you'll see already that actually I'm at 800 EI, so I'm at my sort of base exposure. If I put the white, that's the white of the wave. Again, remember, this is a picture we're looking at 77%. The skin tones of the blonde girl, which is a third of the way across from the left-hand side on the waveform, again, is pretty much, it's a little bit above 60%, but it's in that right sort of ballpark. So we can see that we're correctly exposed. Now, I do actually have a proper grey chart here, and if we do it with the grey chart, let's be a little bit more precise now, and we put white at 77%. Now, this is looking at the LUT. Now I'm going to turn the LUT off. So I can do that actually with the quick menu. And I'm turning the LUT for the stream that you're seeing off. So now what we're looking at, and you'll see it says it just above the waveform, is the S-Log3, S-Log3, S-Gamut3 Cine, SG3C, S-Log3. Now, middle grey, we know for S-Log3 should be 41%. So let me go into the full menu again, and I'm going to put Zebra 1 down to 41%. And it's almost like a magic trick when you do this, because now the 41% line, the lower line, goes right the way through middle grey. So that confirms that we're correctly exposed. So I have middle grey when I'm looking at the S-Log at 41%. When I put the LUT back on, we have 77% going through the white. So we are absolutely correctly exposed. And when I bring this up to the picture, you'll see we are correctly exposed. Now the light is slightly different on the chart to the picture, so there is a small difference between the two. So make use of these orange lines. They are really, really useful for getting the exposure right, provided you know what the correct levels should be. And you don't have to necessarily have a fancy test chart. Any white piece of paper will be pretty close, and in fact the wall just behind here, white wall, it's a matte white wall, it's matte white paint, you'll see that that is at 77%. So you don't necessarily need to get an assistant or a runner or yourself perhaps to run into the shot, just something that is matte, diffuse white, 77%, and you're good. And now, of course, the other thing is I'm using 800 EI, and that gives me a correct base exposure. Now, the exposure index system is what allows me to deliberately over or underexpose my shots. Now, if I go to the low position here on my switch on the side of the camera, I've got this set for 400 EI. And you can see as I go between 800 and 400, the picture gets darker. So the picture is now dark. What do you do when you look at a dark picture in a camera? Well, you bring the exposure up. And I'm not sure I've got enough light to actually bring it up enough. No, I haven't. This lens is not very fast. So I'm just going to actually, I wouldn't normally do this, but I'm just doing this for this. I'm using a 2-frame slow shutter. So slow shutter, 2 frames. So we're shooting at 24 frames per second. So at 24 frames per second, 2F is 2 frames. So that is half of 24. If it was 4 frames, it would be a quarter of 24. So half of 24 is 1/12. So currently my shutter is 1/12. The slow shutter is really useful when you're using the S&Q function and shooting at, say, 1 frame per second, doing a time lapse or something like that. And you want to have those blurry car headlights and things like that, because you can use a 64-frame slow shutter, which is about 3 and a bit seconds, and then use 3 frames per second, and 1 frame per second. And then in post, you speed that up times 3. So each frame, you're only using each of the subsequent frames. And you get beautiful, smeary, blurry car headlights and things like that in time lapse and things like that. So slow shutter is really useful. The only reason I'm using it right now is the lens that I'm using is Sony's 24-240 zoom lens. And when I'm zoomed in like this, I'm at 200 millimeters. The aperture drops down to 6.3, and I don't have a great deal of light in here. So I'm using the slow shutter just so I can deliberately expose much brighter. So now looking at the chart, you can see that that top orange line is going roughly through the white on the picture. Let's use the test chart because that's going to be a bit more accurate. Let's expose that correctly. Okay, so that's correctly exposed. And now when I turn the LUT off, what we're going to see, of course, is that my S-log3 should be at around, it'll be close to just under 50%. It'll be much higher. So it'll be well above my middle gray. It's about 50% thereabouts, yes, because it's a stopover. So it's just under 50%. So what that's doing now, it means that we're recording exposed 1 stop brighter, but it looks normal in the viewfinder. So when I put the LUT back on again, we have a normal looking picture, but my recording is 1 stop brighter. And provided you expose so that your picture looks correct in the viewfinder, or your white piece of paper is at 77% with S709, you're going to be 1 stop brighter than perhaps Sony's recommendation. And you might find this useful for shooting some night scenes, perhaps. One of the things with Cine EI that's a bit odd is that when you shoot in low light, you actually want to use a lower EI, not a higher one. The temptation would be to use a higher EI to make the picture brighter in the viewfinder, but that's going to lead to a noisy recording. And when you're shooting in a scene that has a low overall darkness, let's say you're shooting that night scene in a street, there's light on your actor, but the rest of the street is dark, you actually want to use a lower EI because you want to be sure that you're well exposed. If you use a high EI, then there's a fairly good chance you'll end up with not enough light on the sensor because a high EI will make you close your aperture down, if anything, and that can be misleading. You get into post-production, it's like, why is this so noisy? So shooting in lower light levels, or whether you have a low average light level, use a lower EI, lower than 800, or if you're at the high base ISO of 12,800, use a lower EI, perhaps 6,400, to really, in those situations, make sure that you don't have excessive noise. So high EI, I would almost never ever use an EI higher than the base ISO. So I never use 1600 when I'm shooting at 800 base, and I would never use 24,000 EI if I'm shooting at 12,800 base, because you can guarantee that's going to be noisy. So you always want to go down rather than up. So some more questions. So let's just bring this one up. When shooting in Cine EI and the gain ISO switch, I get a noticeable change in the LCD screen, exposure and zebras, but my HDMI output to my Atomos recorder doesn't make a change. Why is that? Right, so that's your settings in the viewfinder here. So let's do that. What that is, I suspect, the viewfinder, what's probably happening here is that is probably possibly off, and then you just have the LUT on for the viewfinder. So you'll see the change to what you're doing in the viewfinder because it's got the LUT on it, but you won't see a change on the SDI and HDMI because there's no LUT on it. The EI only changes the LUT. It does not change the log. How you change your aperture or your shutter speed is what changes the log. If you've got the LUT on here as well, then you will see exactly the same changes on the SDI and HDMI out as you will in the viewfinder. So that's probably what that is. So another question here. FS7 gave 3 white balance settings in S-Log3 and Cine. Has this changed in the FX6 as I now can do a white balance? Yes, it's all changed in the FX6. So the FX6 now gives you the ability to use whatever white balance you want in the Cine EI mode. Now my recommendation is to use a white card and to white balance off a white target wherever you can. And the reason for that is presets are fine. You can use the presets if you want. You could dial in your own color temperature if you want, but those only basically change the gain of the red and the blue channels. Green stays the same, and then you adjust the red and blue either side. So if you have more red and less blue, the picture becomes warmer. More blue, less red, it becomes cooler, but green stays in the middle. So you can make the pictures warmer or cooler with presets and all of those sorts of things. Oh, that's embarrassing. I left my phone on. We don't want that. Hang on a minute. Let me just put that on off. Sorry about that. How unprofessional. Red and green, warmer, cooler. But because the red and blue, warmer, cooler, because the green doesn't change, we have no effect over the tint or the hue of the image. And very often the problem that you get with your camera when you're shooting isn't necessarily that it's too warm or too cool. It's that maybe the skin tones look a bit weird for some reason, or some aspect of the image just doesn't look quite right. And that's generally because the tint is wrong. Now, if you white balance off a white card, that tint is taken into account. So you'll get a much better result white balancing off a white card. And if you're using 2 cameras together, and this has come up a lot in the forums and the groups with these cameras. So we have the FX3, A7S3 even. We have the FX6, FX9, and even Venice. Let's exclude Venice for a minute, but FX and FX3, that was the other one I was thinking of. FX3, 6, 9, A7S3. If you put them into S-Cinetone, or you put them into S-Log3 and you use a preset in all of those cameras, they will look very slightly different. And in fact, you could even have two FX6s side by side with the same preset value and it won't be identical. And that could be that the lens is having an effect on your image. It could be that the ND filter is having an effect. All sorts of things have an effect on that color temperature. But if you white balance with a white card, that takes care of that tint or any differences, and the cameras will match. And I think a lot of people have tried shooting with their FX3 side by side with the FX6, and it's like, it's really, really close, but it's not the same. As soon as they start white balancing with a white card, and also with the FX9, that difference goes away, the cameras match far, far better, and post-production grading, etc. becomes much, much easier. So I would always recommend that now you can white balance off a white card, to always do it that way, because you will get a much more consistent result. And that's not a fault or a defect in these cameras. It's always been that way, even with the much more expensive broadcast cameras. You could have 4 or 5 of them, and those 4 or 5 supposedly matching cameras would never actually be identical, not truly identical at the same preset, just because of calibration and tolerances and things like that. So white balancing with a white card, though, eliminates that problem. Let's go have a look at some of these other questions that have come in. Do I think Sony will ever release their own monitor recorders that will record XOCN from the FX6? Because ProRes RAW is not supported in DaVinci Resolve. Oh, how I wish that ProRes RAW was supported in DaVinci Resolve, as do a lot of us, I'm sure. Personally, this is opinion only. I have no knowledge of this either way. No, is my answer. Sony will probably want to keep XOCN for Venice and the higher tier cameras. And I also think you need to think about the cost of the media. I don't know if you've looked into how much the media costs to record XOCN. But if you want an R7 and some XOCN media, if you wanted enough media to record an hour at 60 frames per second, I think the media itself is going to cost you probably 10,000 euros, 10,000 pounds, that sort of figure, just for the recording media. And then you've got to buy the R7 or a recorder as well. Let's say another 5,000 euros, 6,000 euros. Suddenly you're into a 15,000 or more euro, 15,000 pound investment to record the output from a 6,000 pound camera. The numbers just don't really add up. And this camera is not as good as Venice. Trust me, it isn't. The image quality, it's really, really good, but it's not a Venice. The FX9 produces a better image when you start really getting into the details. And the benefits that XOCN is going to give you over, to be honest, the XAVC-I, it's not night and day. I think there is a perception that RAW dramatically changes everything about what you can shoot and what you can do in post and everything else. It doesn't. It is the way to get every last ounce of image quality out of these cameras. There is no doubt about that 16-bit RAW would be fantastic, and it would squeeze every last single drop of what this camera can deliver out of the camera. But to be honest, the XAVC-I codec is already recording 98, 99% of what the camera can deliver. There's not an issue with compression artifacts and things like that. Yes, it is a highly compressed codec. Yes, there is some degradation of the image because it's that highly compressed. But I think if most people were to take XAVC-I into post, and if, let's say, you could get XOCN out of the camera and take that into post and grade both equally, whether the audience would be able to tell the difference, I don't know. And RAW doesn't give you more dynamic range. It doesn't give you more color. It doesn't give you more of anything. Basically, the only thing RAW ever gives you is less compression. You can change your white balance of XAVC-I just the same as you can change the white balance of RAW. This whole thing of RAW, you can change the ISO, RAW, you can change the white balance is absolute nonsense. It's a complete internet myth that the camera manufacturers are perfectly happy for everyone to believe because it sells RAW recorders, it sells RAW as a format. But you take XAVC-I and S-Log3 into Catalyst Browse, which understands S-Log3 correctly, processes it correctly, and try the white balance slider in there. And you can go from 2000K to 7000K and everything in between smoothly, perfectly, totally convincingly. Try the ISO slider, it goes up and down. Even when you're shooting with RAW, that sensor in this camera is capturing one white balance and one exposure. It's not capturing every exposure and every white balance. So even RAW, when you have those sliders, is effectively grading what you've captured to deliver a new white balance or a new effective ISO. If you're changing the ISO, you're changing the gain in post, just the same as you would do with S-Log. So RAW is not a magic bullet. Absolutely, if you want to squeeze every last ounce that you can out of a camera like this, then RAW is the way to go. But it's not a night and day difference between the XAVC-I. It's not going to suddenly transform everything you do into magically wonderful pictures that you can do anything with. It really isn't. So, think carefully as to whether it's worth it on a camera at this price point and within the limitations of what this sensor can deliver. So, I mean, when you're looking at Venice, you have a 6K sensor, so you're oversampling. You have better optical low-pass filtering because it's a 6K sensor. You have higher dynamic range and everything. With this camera, the optical low-pass filter isn't as well optimized as it could be. The FX9, which is again is a 6K camera, better optical low-pass filter, and that gives you some subtle nuances and things in the image, very subtle differences, but it means that the FX9 does deliver overall a slightly better image than the FX6 does. So if you want to go the RAW route, really you'd be better off getting an FX9. I know you've got to put the XDCA on the back and all of those things, but when you're talking about trying to extract every last little bit of image quality, you really want to start with as much image quality off the sensor as you can get. And much as I love the FX6 and it does deliver a beautiful image, it has some limitations. It's a great camera, but it has. Frankly, with the FX6, rather than going down the RAW route, what I tend to actually do is just to record on my Ninja. This is my own Ninja 5 here in ProRes. 10-bit ProRes. It's a little bit less compressed than the XAVC-I. Again, it's not a night and day difference, but I can take that 10-bit ProRes directly into DaVinci Resolve. And this is the important thing, is that whole workflow. It's all very well looking at one aspect of your workflow, whether that's the recording codec or whether you're shooting with RAW or whatever, but it's your whole workflow that counts. So if you can take 10-bit ProRes directly into DaVinci Resolve and grade that, compared to taking ProRes RAW and working in FCP, I actually believe that most people will get a better end result by recording the 10-bit ProRes, taking it into into DaVinci Resolve, grading it in DaVinci Resolve, a proper piece of grading software with all the proper grading tools, and I think that will actually deliver a better quality end result than recording ProRes RAW, going into FCP and working in an editing application and doing your grading. Obviously, if you are somebody that uses FCP already, it's a great workflow. It's going to deliver the best that you can get out of FCP, it really is. But if you don't use FCP, 10-bit log is immensely gradable anyway. Let's have a look through some of these. So a question that's come in is, so a couple of things. How do you adjust the colors in S-Cinetone for perfect colors using matrix and multi-matrix? That would require a workshop all of its own. S-Cinetone, you can only use, I've got to remind myself actually, let me just go into, back into custom mode. So go back into custom mode. And then if I go into the main menu, and go into my paint settings. So we do have a user matrix with S-Cinetone. Now user matrix and adjusting this is a real dark art science. And I wouldn't recommend people start fiddling around with this if you don't understand how it works, because each of these settings interacts with the others. You cannot just change one without upsetting the others. And it's very easy to be fiddling around with it, come up with a look you like, and then you go out and you start shooting something, and then you realize, well, hang on a minute, the grass is now blue. It should be green. It's really easy to make a mess with the multi-matrix. It's something that experiment if you wish, but I wouldn't recommend it. The multi-matrix is much easier. So with the multi-matrix, we can now choose a specific color, in this case blue. But the thing to understand with this blue is a very, very narrow, particular shade of blue. It's not all the blues in the color spectrum. It is just what this camera determines to be a very specific shade of blue. And we can adjust that. We can change the hue of it, we can make it greener or redder, and we can change the saturation so we can make it more or less intense. Now, if you wanted to make your images more blue, let's just, I don't need this silly shutter speed now, let me get rid of that. Right. So if I wanted to make this more blue, let's say I wanted to make the sky bluer, what you would think is, oh, I can just go into the multi-matrix, we can choose blue, and we can boost the saturation, and the sky will get bluer. And as I turn that all the way up, you'll see that actually the sea is getting bluer, but the sky isn't. And that's because the shade of blue that the sky is a different shade of blue. So we'd actually then need to go to the axis here. And I think the sky is likely to be B minus, and we would have to bring that up as well. And no, perhaps it's cyan plus. Yeah, that's cyan plus. So that shade of blue that the sky is cyan plus. So you need to change not just the core color, as it were. So if you're just changing the blue, you need to change the cyan plus and the ones either side so that all of your blue tones are changed. And of course, you can change all of the different settings in here, so you can actually, you're not just changing one. Now I am just going to turn this, you can see now how I've made the sky and the sea bluer. So you can use multi-matrix to adjust your S-cinetone if you want. If you want it all more saturated, you can do that quickly in the matrix. If you turn the matrix on, user matrix on, and level, and you increase the level, you can increase the saturation. So you can make it more colorful. That's probably the only setting that I would mess around with in the main matrix settings is the level, as it's a quick way to make the pictures more or less saturated. And that's about actually the limit of what you can do with S-cinetone, because most of the other settings, as you can see, are blanked out for S-cinetone because of the complicated shape of the curve. So going through the question. So how do we load LUTs? Well, I don't have a card here actually with LUTs on. So the way to load LUTs, though, whether you're in the custom mode or Cine EI, because it uses the same memories for LUTs for custom mode, which then becomes your base look, and in Cine EI, where you load a LUT into the camera for Cine EI. So you do it in the paint menu, and it doesn't matter whether you're in the Cine EI mode or in the custom mode, and you put a SD card in the lower slot, slot 2 of the camera with the LUTs on it, and you go to this base look setting, and you go to import, and then you'll have, if you haven't loaded any, you'll see lots of these empty slots where it says no LUT in here, and you select an empty slot, and then just below where it says back right now, all the LUTs that are on your card would appear. You would select the LUT that you want and then import it. And then those LUTs become usable in both Cine EI and custom mode. And they just need to be 33 times cube LUTs, nothing particularly fancy about the LUTs. My Venice look LUTs, I haven't upgraded them for the FX6 because the FX6 has the same curve as Venice. It doesn't have the green tint that the FX9 used to have. Now, if you've got an FX9, if you've got the very latest firmware in it, that's now resolved. That issue's gone. The FX6 will take the actual Sony Venice LUT, and that will get you as close as possible to the way Venice looks. So that's Sony's S709 LUT. It's actually the LUT that's already in here. It's not available as a LUT, but it's already built into the camera. So when you go to the Cine EI mode and use S709, that is the Venice look. And that's as close as you're going to get with this camera. There's no point in me making another LUT because it won't get closer than that with this camera. So that's why I haven't changed those. So how are we doing? We've certainly filled the time slot. So let me just look at what we're going to cover. Yeah, frame rates and S&Q motion to finish off, because I did say we'd cover that. So S&Q motion on this camera, we can go from basically 1 frame per second all the way up to 120 frames per second in 4K. And we can also go to 240 frames per second in HD. I wouldn't recommend using anything above 120 frames per second. There is a significant drop in picture quality. Frankly, I don't think it's particularly usable above 120 frames per second because of that drop in image quality. 120 frames per second looks absolutely fantastic. So we can use that. Now, if you want to shoot at perhaps between, let's say, 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second, there's 2 ways of doing it. We can either, if I go into the quick menu here, we can either do it by changing the scan rate, and I'm not going to change it because it will upset the vision mixer I'm using here. But if we wanted to shoot at 60p or 59.94, we could shoot this way, and you could take that into post-production, and when you play it back, it will play back at normal speed because it will be playing back at 59.94 frames per second. But if your project is at, say, 24 frames per second, you could then slow that down in post-production by 2.5 times, that 60p, to get down to 24, and you would have smooth slow motion. The beauty of recording this way is you get audio with your recording. When we shoot at the standard base rates, the audio is recorded. Now, the other way we could do it is we could use S&Q motion. So just come out of there. If I press the S&Q button, I could select a frame rate from, we can go down to 1, all the way up to, because I'm in 4K, 120 frames per second. But when we shoot this way, there's no audio recorded. So that's something to consider. If I shoot at 120 frames per second, play it back at 24 frames per second, that is 5-6 times slowdown. It really works very nicely, gives you some really great slow motion, and it looks really great. But that's the rate it will play back slowed down. Now, in terms of, is there anything special that you need to know when you're shooting S&Q motion? No, there isn't. The camera just does it, and it just works, and it's really simple. So really, there's not a lot to cover in this area because you don't have all the different scan modes and things like that you have to understand with the FX9 and those cameras, because it basically will go up to 120 frames per second without you changing anything. Now, one thing to be aware of is that when you go from, as I am now, shooting 24 frames per second, and you go to shoot in S&Q motion, there will be a slight crop in the frame when you go to 120 frames per second, and that's because the sensor in the camera is actually about 4.2K, and when you're shooting at normal speeds, it's using the full 4.2K sensor. When you go to 120 frames per second, it's only using the 3.8K, 3840 by 2160 of the sensor for a direct readout because that's faster, so you get a slight crop into the image. But you, as the camera operator, don't need to do anything. That just happens automatically. So that's just something to bear in mind. And the same when you shoot RAW, actually, with this camera, is there's a slight crop in to 4K of pixels from the 4.2 that's actually there when you're using the RAW mode of the camera. To be honest, you don't notice any difference in quality. Oversampling 4.2K to 4K isn't going to give you anything noticeable. It really isn't. So it's not something to get hung up on that you haven't got 4.2K that you're using. Now, one aspect that I use a lot with this camera is actually it's not just shooting at high speed, but also at low speed. If you want to do time-lapse, shooting at 1 frame per second or 2 or 3 frames per second gives you really nice time-lapse. And as I mentioned earlier, as we discussed this earlier, you can combine that with the slow shutter to get really nice, smooth, blurry motion. So it really is a very powerful little workhorse camera, the FX6. So, so the questions come in, how do you shoot at 240 frames per second? To shoot at 240 frames per second, you have to put the camera into HD. And you shoot in, once you're in HD, the S&Q motion will go to 240 frames per second. But it's well below HD. Excuse me. The image quality is well below HD. It's about 1K. I think it's something like 960 pixels. I really wouldn't do it. It's nasty. You're better off, I think, shooting at 120 frames per second, and if you need to go even slower, just slowing that down in post. I think that is actually going to give you a nicer, more pleasing result than trying to use the HD mode and then going to 240 frames per second. There's a lot of pixel skipping and line skipping that goes on shooting in that mode, so you get a lot of aliasing and moire, you get a lot of jagged edges, it's very low resolution, and there's just so many reasons not to do it, really. So I really wouldn't recommend it, but to access it, the camera has to be in HD and shooting in the HD mode, and then you can access it via the S&Q button, but the image quality is really not great. So we really have overrun. It was going to be a 45-minute session, but it's almost 12:15. I'll just give you a few last seconds to get in any last questions. Let me just go through the comments and questions that have come in. So one thing that's been asked is about supply shortage. Actually, it's another one that I've spotted there. So in terms of delivery and supply of cameras, there is a global supply shortage of all sorts of things. It's not just the microchips that go into the cameras. It's the silly things like some of the support stuff that's required in the machines that make the cameras. So there is currently a lot of reasons and a lot of issues around manufacturing electronics. And it's not just affecting Sony. Jaguar Land Rover, for example, the car manufacturer had to stop production of their cars for quite some time because they couldn't get the electronics they need for the cars. So it's affecting everybody. If you look around at the prices of electronic products, you'll see they're creeping up at the moment. And in fact, a lot of things are creeping up in price because there's shipping delays, because there's been this huge backlog of stuff from the whole of the pandemic. It was on the news here in the UK just yesterday talking about shortages that may come at Christmas of the sort of things that people buy as gifts because they're not prioritized as goods right now. There's a shortage of shipping containers, and ships and containers are in the wrong places, so that's causing delays still. There is a huge shortage of chips and semiconductors because normally they would be stockpiled. Those stockpiles have gone. So everything is delayed. Sony are doing everything that they can to produce these cameras, but if they can't get the chips, they can't make the cameras. It's really as simple as that. So at the moment, they are still in short supply. The best way to get a camera quickly, and it may not actually be that quickly, but the fastest way you'll get a camera is going to be to talk to the guys here, talk to the dealer. I think Visual Impact have a little bit of a benefit in that being a little bit smaller perhaps than some of the giant dealers, they can be a little bit more nimble. So as stock levels change and everything like that, they can react much more quickly. And also, you've got to consider that a big supplier, let's take B&H in the US, they probably have tens of thousands of orders that come in. So you have no idea where you are in that wait list. And if they only get a few cameras come in, there's going to be a huge number of people disappointed. Whereas to go to a slightly smaller dealer, more personal dealer, they'll be able to tell you, straight up, this is how long our wait list is, this is where you are on the list, and this is what we're expecting and when we're expecting to get the stock in. So do talk to the guys, pick up the phone and call them, or send them an email. And if you want to place an order, speak to them. But there are shortages, and it doesn't seem to actually be getting significantly better. The cameras are coming, but not in vast numbers. But it is something that Sony are desperately trying to address, because they want to sell cameras. This isn't Sony deliberately restricting the sales. They really, really want to sell the cameras. They really do. So something else that was asked, let me just find it. Oh, where is that gone? No, can't find that one. Yeah, so a question about 6400 ISO when using 12800 base. So one of the things that I'm not particularly a huge fan of actually in this camera is 12800 ISO is fantastic when you have very, very little light for shooting in those sorts of situations. But it is a little bit noisier than the 800 base ISO. Really what I would like is something in between, because 12800 for so many things is actually too much. Shooting in a street at night, if it's got street lights, 12800 is more than you need. So a nice ISO to shoot at is typically somewhere around 3200 to 6400. So how do we get to 3200 ISO or 6400 ISO without the camera becoming noisy? Because if you were to just use a high EI from 800, you're going to end up with a very noisy picture, because you'll end up effectively underexposed. So the best way to do it is to go to 12800 ISO, to use the high base ISO. And then there's different ways you can do it. You could use a low EI, but if you start going to very low EIs, just going from 12800 to 6400 EI, it's only one stop. So that's not a problem. I would perfectly happy all day in the Cine EI mode, just drop down from 12800 to 6400 EI and shoot that way, because you're unlikely to have a highlight problem when you're shooting in very, very low light levels, generally speaking. If you want to shoot at 3200, it becomes a little bit more challenging, because if you drop your EI down to 3200, you're going to lose 2 stops of highlight range, which can be quite hurtful if you've got some bright highlights in your shot. So what we have to then sort of think about is, what do we have in this camera that can make it less sensitive? And the answer is the ND filter. The ND filter is not just there for when you have too much light. You can use the ND filter to effectively make, if we think of the camera as a whole, to make the camera as a whole less sensitive. So if we put in the basic ND, the minimum amount, which is a quarter ND, that's 2 stops, the camera overall becomes 2 stops less sensitive. And that then becomes the equivalent of a camera that is 3200 ISO when it's set to 12800 base. So, don't be afraid to use the ND filter. I know it seems really weird. You're shooting in lower light levels, perhaps it's a bit dark. You've gone to 12800 high base because 800 isn't enough. But then if that 12800 is too much, use the ND filter. That's what it's there for. And if you add a quarter ND, that would be the same as having the camera set to 3200 ISO in terms of the overall sensitivity. Yes, I know it's still 12800 ISO and 2 stops of ND, but if you wanted to put that in your light meter, if you had a light meter, you could put 3200 in your light meter, and that would then give you the correct exposure. Just ignore the ND filter, just include that in your calculations. So don't be afraid to derate the camera from 12800 with the ND filter if that's what you really need to do. It works very well. AF, autofocus. Yeah, so autofocus only works above the base frame rate. So when you're using S&Q at multiples of your base rate. So if you're shooting at 25p, it will only work at 25, 50, 100 frames per second. If you're shooting at 24p, it will work at 120 frames per second and 60 frames per second, because 24 into 120 goes. It works. So it depends on your frame rates. There are limitations in S&Q. That is just a limitation of the camera. There's not much you can do about that. It's just one of those things. So I'm going to wrap and close the session up now. I don't see any more questions. Yeah, hang on. No, there is another one. So a question that's come in here is white card versus grey card for white balance, which is better? Provided it's a good quality grey card, I would prefer to use a grey card. And the reason for that is that when you're using white to white balance, it's quite close to where your overexposure would be. And if your white card is a little bit overexposed, because of the way the gammas in the camera work, especially in custom mode, the color actually is desaturated as you start to overexpose. The camera desaturates. So any color tint on that white card, because your white balance is off, actually becomes less if you're overexposed. Whereas a gray card exposed correctly, it won't have that color desaturation going on, so you'll actually get a more accurate white balance. The difference is minor. It really is. And I mean, provided your white card is exposed correctly, you'll get an accurate white balance. And it really does actually need to be a proper white card, because one of the problems with paper, if you use printer paper and things like that, is it's dyed. So printer paper is dyed very slightly blue to make it appear bright. If you think about clothes, you think about all the clothes washing commercials, and they talk about these brilliant whites. Well, often your laundry detergent is actually making your clothes very slightly blue, because to us as human beings, that looks a brighter shade of white than white. It's like car headlights. If they're bluer, they tend to look brighter. So white paper that you buy for printing, photocopier paper, all of that is actually generally a little bit blue. So whenever you white balance off that, your pictures will be slightly on the warm side, and you'll probably find you get slightly magenta skin tones. So ideally, you want a proper white card. It's worth buying one. They're not that expensive. If you buy a color checker chart, there's a white and gray on the back of that. Use that, because you will get a more accurate white balance. But you can white balance off either. The results aren't greatly different unless you're overexposing. But then generally, if you're very overexposed, the camera will tell you anyway if you try and white balance and it's too overexposed. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, but gray card or white card both work very, very well. My favorite is this one that I have got in here, which is this great big thing here. It's a huge chart. It's very big, white in the center, gray on the outside, very expensive as well, unfortunately. But because it's nice and big, I can, when you bring it into the scene, it's a really good size. So it's much easier to get a balance off it. So with that, I will end the workshop. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful. The recording of this will remain available on YouTube, so you can come back and watch it again if you want to. And hopefully we'll do some more of these in the near future. Have a great day. Thanks for watching.